Hello, friends. I'm glad you are here tonight. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world, each in their own room. Some may be drifting towards sleep, some perhaps wide awake in the middle of the day. No matter where you are, this story will carry us into a world both frightening and captivating. The world of the darkest legends that emerged during the Second World War. Legends so heavy that people whispered them at night and carried them in silence during the day. When most of us think of the war, we imagine tanks rolling through ruined streets, soldiers in gray uniforms, cities on fire, and long lines of refugees. But hidden beneath those visible horrors were the rumors, the half-told stories, the whispers between neighbors when lights were dim and shutters closed. In occupied towns, people said the shadows were not only filled with soldiers, but with creatures that fed on human misery. Some swore they saw black dogs roaming the streets, dogs that did not belong to anyone and that vanished when approached. Others believed that certain villages were cursed, marked by fire and forever doomed, because every time the front line shifted, those same villages were the first to burn again. But the strangest legends were not about animals or curses. They were about the human spirit itself. People spoke of men who returned from the front with eyes so empty that no light could touch them. They said these men were alive in body but gone in soul, wandering through villages like husks. Children were told not to stare at them too long, for if you looked directly into their faces, the emptiness would seep into you as well, and you too would lose your will to live. Imagine being a child in such a place, walking through streets where rubble replaced homes, where the smell of smoke hung heavy, and being told by your grandmother to avoid not just soldiers but also neighbors who had seen too much. Food, of course, was scarce. In cities like Warsaw or Kiev under occupation, bread became a currency more precious than gold. Families boiled thin soups from whatever they could find. Potato peels, weeds pulled from gardens, sometimes even sawdust mixed into flour. Yet alongside this daily hunger, people invented ways to distract themselves from despair. There are records of children in ghettos creating puppet shows from scraps of cloth, their laughter faint but stubborn, like sparks in the dark. Even in the shadows of terror, people clung to small acts of defiance, believing that to smile, even briefly, was to remind themselves they were still human. One of the most terrifying legends whispered in occupied Europe was the story of the Midnight Train. According to those who claimed to have seen it, this train appeared without warning, moving silently along abandoned tracks. It carried no coal, no smoke, and made no sound of metal on rails. Yet people swore that they could see its carriages filled with pale faces pressed against the windows. Some thought they were the souls of the dead, taken away to some unknown place. Others believed the Germans used secret trains at night to move prisoners, and the silence was engineered to avoid detection. But the strangest part of the story is that the train was said to vanish midway along the track, dissolving into mist. Was it a legend born of fear and sleepless nights or something else? No one could prove it, but the tale was so widespread that mothers told their children to stay inside after dark, in case the midnight train came for them. Life under occupation was a strange mixture of crushing routine and sudden chaos. In some towns, people still tried to celebrate birthdays quietly, baking small cakes from whatever ingredients they could gather, maybe using carrots to sweeten dough when sugar was gone. In others, music drifted from hidden cellars, where old gramophones played scratched records to small crowds who dared to dance for a moment before curfew. These moments of normality were both fragile and dangerous, because if soldiers found out, punishment was severe. Yet still, people risked it. The human need for connection, for joy, is sometimes stronger than fear. As the war dragged on, stories grew darker. There was talk of forests that swallowed entire groups of people, never to return. Travelers warned that if you entered certain woods at night, you could hear voices calling your name, though no one was there. Perhaps these were echoes of partisans hiding in the trees, or perhaps they were echoes of the countless who had died there. One chilling account describes a villager who claimed that he followed a voice into the forest during an air raid, thinking it was his missing brother, only to emerge hours later with frost covering his clothes, though it was summer. Whether truth or delusion, such stories spread because they explained what could not otherwise be explained. And through all of this, survival meant improvisation. Children played games with bottle caps instead of marbles. Women made shoes from strips of old tires. Men carved spoons and cups from wood when metal was impossible to find. Even in the bleakest times, creativity did not vanish, it adapted. Imagine the strength it took to sit by candlelight, surrounded by hunger and fear, and still craft something with your hands, just to remind yourself you were more than a victim. As I tell you this, think of the weight of silence in those nights, the way people whispered stories because speaking too loudly might attract the wrong ears. The most terrible legends often began in that silence, where fear and imagination blended until no one could tell what was real and what was not. Perhaps that is why these tales survived so long. They were not just entertainment, they were survival, a way of making sense of a world torn apart by war. And so, as we move deeper into this journey, we will walk alongside those people, ordinary men, women, and children, who lived under the shadow of German occupation, who shared their food, their secrets, and their fears, and who carried with them legends that remain haunting even now. When the days of occupation stretched into months, people began to measure time differently. No longer by calendars or clocks, but by sounds and silences, by the rhythm of boots on cobblestones, by the faint whistle of trains in the night, or by the rare moment when the town square seemed strangely still. Silence itself became suspicious, for silence often meant that something was about to happen, something no one wanted to witness. Mothers would pull children indoors when the streets grew too quiet, because quiet was often followed by trucks arriving or soldiers shouting orders that left no room for questions. And yet, inside homes with shuttered windows, life continued with a strange kind of persistence. Families gathered around oil lamps, or sometimes just a single candle, telling stories to distract from hunger and fear. Some of these stories were hopeful, tales of distant relatives who would come back after the war, or of hidden treasures that might be unearthed when peace returned. But just as often, the stories turned into whispered legends, frightening in their detail, passed down as if they were warnings disguised as fables. One of these legends told of a soldier who could not die. The tale began in whispers on the Eastern Front, where winters were so brutal that men froze in their trenches. Soldiers spoke of a man in a tattered uniform who wandered between battlefields, always appearing after the fighting had ended. His uniform bore no insignia, and his face was hidden beneath a scarf, but his presence chilled even the bravest. Some swore that he had been shot dozens of times, and yet he walked on, as though pain and death had forgotten him. Villagers said he was a cursed soul, doomed to wander until the war ended, though no one knew whether he brought good fortune or doom to those who saw him. Was he a ghost of a fallen soldier, or a living man who had lost his humanity? The uncertainty only made the story more powerful. Food remained at the center of daily struggle. In many occupied towns, entire families survived on what could be bartered at markets. An onion traded for a piece of soap, or a handful of flour exchanged for a few nails. People grew inventive, creating meals from things no one would have eaten before the war. Bread was sometimes baked from acorn flour, dark and bitter, but still nourishing. Soup might be made from nettles or dandelion leaves. There are diaries from that time that describe the taste of these strange meals not with disgust, but with gratitude, because anything that filled the stomach, even briefly, was a victory. Still, hunger bred desperation, and desperation gave rise to more legends. In the winter of 1942, in several eastern villages, people began speaking of the bread thief, not an ordinary criminal, but a figure described with unsettling detail. According to the stories, this thief wore no shoes, left no footprints in the snow, and yet bread would vanish from locked cupboards and sealed cellars. Sometimes, the family would awaken to find the door still bolted from the inside, yet food was missing. Neighbors blamed one another, but when no explanation came, the tale of the invisible thief spread like frost across windows. Some claimed he was a starving ghost, cursed to wander forever seeking food, but never finding enough. Mothers warned their children not to leave bread unattended, for if the bread thief smelled it, he would come silent and unseen. Whether it was simply a way to explain theft in desperate times or something darker, the legend took on a life of its own. Amid fear and famine, people clung to strange forms of entertainment. In one Polish town, a man carved chess pieces from bones and taught children to play by candlelight. In another, an old violin was passed secretly from house to house, its music carrying hope from one family to the next. Sometimes even soldiers would pause outside to listen, and for a moment, the boundary between occupier and occupied blurred, though only briefly. Music reminded people of who they had been before the war, and who they might still be when it ended. But not all forms of entertainment were so gentle. Some villagers gathered at night to share ghost stories, each darker than the last, as though trying to prove they could not be frightened further than they already were. They spoke of abandoned houses where windows glowed though no one lived inside, or of wells that whispered when you leaned too close. These tales might sound like the inventions of restless minds, but in times when death was everywhere, the supernatural felt close, almost logical. Fear of soldiers and fear of spirits blurred together until both felt equally real. One particularly chilling account came from a small town in Belarus. People there spoke of a church bell that rang by itself at midnight, though the ropes had been cut and no one dared climb the tower. Each time it rang, someone in the town disappeared by morning, sometimes taken by soldiers, sometimes found lifeless in the fields. No one could explain the sound, and yet it was heard by many. Even after the war, survivors remembered that bell as something darker than coincidence. Daily life remained a strange balance of suffering and adaptation. Children scavenged in ruins, turning twisted metal into toys. Women patched clothes until fabric became more stitches than cloth. Men gathered news in whispers, listening for signs of advancing armies. Everyone measured survival one day at a time, and in that fragile existence, legends flourished because they gave shape to fears too vast to name. Imagine lying in bed on a cold night, hearing boots march past your window, the sound fading into the distance, and then hearing something else. A faint whistle, or a knock, or perhaps just your imagination. In that silence, the mind filled gaps with stories. That is how these legends were born, not as lies, but as coping mechanisms, ways to survive the unbearable. People knew they might not live to see the war's end, but stories, terrible, strange, unforgettable, might carry on even if they could not. And so, with every passing month, the world of the living and the world of whispered legends grew closer together, until it became impossible to say where history ended and imagination began. As the war pressed deeper into its endless years, those who lived under occupation began to feel that reality itself had split in two. There was the visible world, the one of soldiers and curfews, of ration cards and ruined streets. But beneath that world flowed another, unseen and whispered, where every shadow had a story and every sound might be an omen. In this hidden layer of life, legends spread not through newspapers or radios, but through hurried words exchanged in doorways or murmured while drawing water from wells. And the more uncertain life became, the more people clung to these stories as explanations for the inexplicable. In villages across Eastern Europe, children were warned about the Grey Watcher. According to the tale, he was a tall figure in a long coat, his face always hidden beneath a brimmed hat. He never spoke, never touched anyone, but he was always there, standing at a distance, watching silently. People claimed he appeared on the edge of towns just before something terrible happened. Sometimes he was seen near barns that later burned to the ground, or outside homes where arrests were made during the night. Whether he was a spy, a soldier, or something less human, no one could say. Yet his presence crept into the collective mind, So much so that mothers pulled their children inside not only at the sound of marching boots, but also at the sight of a shadow that seemed too still, too deliberate, to be ordinary. The hunger, too, grew sharper, and with hunger came desperation that twisted into myth. One story told of a family who, in their desperation, baked bread not from flour but from ground-up tree bark mixed with water. They ate it gladly, even though it made their mouths bleed. Afterward, the story says, the family vanished, leaving only scraps of bark scattered across the floor. Neighbors whispered that the forest itself had claimed them for stealing its skin. Perhaps it was only a tale invented to scare children from eating what might poison them. Yet in the minds of starving people it became a warning. Take too much from the land, and the land would take you in return. And still, even in these grim times, life carried flickers of stubborn creativity. In a hidden cellar in Prague, young men and women staged plays using scraps of paper for scripts and bits of cloth for costumes. They performed tragedies from memory, their voices echoing softly against the stone walls, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment or worse. Yet to them, the act of telling stories, even in secret, was its own defiance. Some legends even grew out of these performances. One tells of an actress who played the role of death so convincingly that people believed she truly carried the shadow of mortality with her. After the war, survivors swore they saw her in photographs of ruined streets, always in the background, always watching. Daily existence was full of small rituals that made survival possible. People measured food carefully, counting out beans, scraping every last crumb of bread. They hoarded bits of fabric to mend clothes again and again until coats became more patches than original cloth. And at night, when darkness covered the land, they gathered around whatever light they could find to tell each other tales, half-truths and half-fears, because silence was worse than fear. Silence meant surrender. One of the most frightening stories spread in occupied France, where villagers spoke of the children who walked at night. According to whispers, a group of children roamed through towns after curfew, barefoot and silent, their faces pale and expressionless. They knocked on doors, and if someone answered, they asked in hollow voices for bread. If given food, they left without a word. But if refused, it was said that misfortune struck the household within days. Arrests, illness, or sudden fire. Some thought they were orphan children abandoned to hunger. Others believed they were spirits of those who had died from starvation, cursed to wander until their hunger was satisfied. Either way, the story spread widely, so that even long after the war, people swore they had seen small figures on moonlit nights, drifting silently between the ruins. Meanwhile, ordinary joys were not entirely lost. Even in the darkest times, there were weddings, secret, fragile, but real. Brides wore dresses sewn from old curtains, grooms offered rings carved from wood or copper wire, and neighbors whispered blessings instead of singing aloud. These small celebrations carried enormous weight, for they reminded people that love could survive in a world built on fear. And inevitably, stories sprang up around these unions too. Some couples were said to have vanished on the very night of their wedding, carried away by soldiers or perhaps by fate itself. Others were rumored to live forever happy, protected by the courage of having chosen joy in a time of sorrow. In forests and fields, partisans waged their own hidden battles, and with them came more legends. Farmers swore that at night they heard drums echoing in the woods, though no soldiers were near. Sometimes they found footprints in the snow that led nowhere, as if the men who made them had simply vanished into thin air. Some said the partisans were aided by spirits of the land itself, by ancestors who rose from the earth to defend their descendants. Whether true or not, these stories gave people courage, a reason to believe that they were not entirely alone in their struggle. One of the eeriest legends of the time was told in whispers in several countries. The tale of the Lantern Man. He was described as carrying a single lantern that gave off a pale, unnatural light. People claimed he appeared during bombings, walking calmly through streets as chaos raged. He seemed to guide some to safety, while others who followed him vanished, never to be seen again. Survivors argued endlessly about whether he was a protector or a trickster, whether his light led people out of danger or straight into death. No one knew, and that mystery made the story impossible to forget. These stories, born of fear and hunger, were also born of the human need to make sense of what could not be controlled. War created shadows too large for the mind to grasp, so people filled those shadows with figures: watchers, thieves, children, lantern bearers. Legends grew because they gave names to nameless dread, faces to formless terror. And in telling them, people found a strange kind of relief, as if by shaping fear into story, they made it just slightly less unbearable. And so, as the war dragged on, the boundary between survival and myth grew thinner. In every ruined village and occupied city, there were not only soldiers and prisoners, but also watchers in the dark, ghostly children, invisible thieves, bells that rang on their own, and lanterns glowing in the smoke. By now, life under occupation had created a rhythm that was both cruel and oddly structured. A rhythm dictated by curfews, ration lines, and the constant uncertainty of tomorrow. People measured their days not in hours or minutes, but in glimpses of normalcy. Moments when sunlight spilled through broken windows, when a neighbor offered a handful of potatoes, when children laughed despite the weight of everything around them. Yet even in these small joys, the shadow of the unimaginable loomed. Rumors moved faster than food, and whispers often carried more weight than the actual presence of soldiers. There were stories that became so widespread that even the bravest hearts hesitated to test their truth. In several towns in northern Europe, villagers spoke of the silent bell tower. During the day, it appeared ordinary, a stone structure rising above the rooftops. But at night, people swore it emitted sounds that were not the sounds of bells, but voices that whispered secrets, curses, or warnings. Some claimed they could hear the names of townsfolk being called in soft, almost musical tones. A man who responded to these whispers was said to disappear by morning, leaving behind only his shoes at the doorstep. Whether this was imagined or real, everyone agreed that no one dared approach the tower after sunset. And yet, the tower's legend spread, carrying with it a strange mixture of fear and curiosity. Children dared each other to peek through the windows, while adults avoided the street entirely. Amidst these stories, daily survival remained a struggle that required ingenuity and a stubborn will to live. Bread was still the central obsession, but people experimented with substitutes as the war dragged on. In some areas, families boiled turnips, carrots, and even tree bark to stretch soup into multiple meals. Milk was precious and rarely available, yet people used what little they had to soften coarse flour or to make thin puddings for children. Every meal became a careful negotiation with scarcity. And yet, even in the act of eating, imagination took hold. Someone might tell a story about a loaf of bread that could never be finished, or a potato that kept multiplying. Legends meant to lift spirits, even briefly, above the oppression of hunger. Entertainment and diversion took many forms. In Prague and Warsaw, children created miniature puppet theaters from cardboard boxes and bits of fabric, performing elaborate plays for neighbors who gathered in secret. In some cases, partisans assisted by smuggling small instruments to hidden cellars, where young people played violins and flutes, weaving music through the stone walls and into the cold streets above. The music was fragile, vulnerable to discovery, but it brought a strange kind of hope, a reminder that life could continue in miniature even as the larger world burned. Yet it was not all subtle defiance. Legends of more immediate danger persisted, often merging the supernatural with the horrors of reality. The forest walkers, for instance, were said to haunt the edges of woods where resistance fighters hid. These figures were never fully described, only glimpsed. A fleeting shadow, a voice calling from behind a tree, the sudden snapping of a branch. Farmers leaving their homes to collect firewood sometimes swore they felt someone following. Yet when they turned, the forest seemed empty. In a time when raids and disappearances were common, The line between imagination and experience was razor thin, and people began to speak of the forest walkers with the same mixture of reverence and terror as they did of occupying soldiers. In towns occupied for years, even mundane objects took on the weight of legend. A single lantern left burning on a windowsill might be said to ward off ghosts or thieves, while a crack in a wall could be interpreted as a portal where spirits entered to spy on the living. Such beliefs were not mere superstition. They were tools for managing fear, for assigning meaning to a world where so much was incomprehensible. And in this world, rumor became history, and history became legend, until distinguishing between the two was almost impossible. One of the more persistent tales involved a figure known as the Ghost Courier. According to accounts, this spectral messenger appeared in towns where resistance activities were highest, delivering messages that no one could explain. Sometimes the messages were helpful warnings of impending raids, directions to hidden food caches. Other times they seemed to carry misfortune, leading people toward traps or false hope. The Ghost Courier never spoke, only left the notes, sometimes pinned to doors, sometimes tucked into windows. No one knew who or what he was, and that uncertainty made him both feared and revered. Daily life demanded adaptation not only for survival but also for psychological endurance. People carved utensils from wood when metal was unavailable, made shoes from scraps of tire, and patched clothing repeatedly until it was more patchwork than fabric. In some towns, children scavenged in bombed-out streets, finding fragments of metal, glass, and wood to fashion tiny toys. Every act of creativity was an assertion of humanity, a quiet rebellion against the harshness surrounding them. Yet even these small victories were shadowed by the larger context, by the ever-present fear that any moment could bring an air raid, an arrest, or the sudden collapse of a home into rubble. Amid these acts of survival, rumors and legends continued to evolve. The Lantern Man, the Silent Bell Tower, the children who walked at night, and countless other figures merged into a complex web of stories that people repeated to maintain some sense of control. They were warnings, entertainment, coping mechanisms, and sometimes distractions so complete that they almost felt real. A child might insist they saw the Lantern Man pass their window, while a mother murmured to herself that the Silent Bell Tower had not rung that night. These tales became intertwined with everyday life, inseparable from the ordinary and the extraordinary alike. And so, as darkness fell across occupied towns, as ration lines dwindled and whispers traveled faster than soldiers, life became a strange interplay between survival and imagination. People told stories to each other, not only to warn or frighten, but to create a world where, even for a moment, they could impose order on chaos. It was a delicate balance, one maintained through courage, creativity, and the shared understanding that the legends of today might become the history of tomorrow. As the seasons shifted, the war brought both visible destruction and invisible scars, shaping lives in ways that were impossible to measure. Villagers learned to read the subtle signs of approaching danger, the distant rumble of tanks, the smell of smoke from a nearby city, or the faint vibrations in the ground that suggested artillery fire had begun somewhere beyond the horizon. Even in moments of calm, people carried tension like a second skin, and their imaginations filled the gaps, giving rise to new legends almost every week. These stories were not only about fear but also about survival, about trying to impose meaning on a world that offered none. One of the most persistent stories in the occupied territories involved a peculiar figure known as the Shadow Nurse. According to whispered accounts, she appeared during outbreaks of disease in towns where hygiene and food were scarce. Some said she carried no medicine, yet anyone touched by her hand recovered miraculously, while others vanished mysteriously in her presence. Her face was never fully seen, hidden behind a veil or beneath a dark hood, and she seemed to appear only when despair was highest. Families would leave offerings, small candles, bits of bread, hoping to earn her favor, though no one could explain whether she was human or something beyond comprehension. The story persisted in part because it gave people hope, a tiny spark in the otherwise relentless darkness. Hunger remained a constant companion. In towns stripped of resources, families became experts in improvisation. People boiled weeds for tea, roasted the roots of wild plants to create something resembling coffee, and turned leaves and stalks into edible flour. Children often joined these efforts, learning from their parents how to stretch every morsel, how to hide extra rations for future days, and how to find sustenance in places most adults would never dare. In diaries and letters smuggled out of occupied zones, survivors recounted with both horror and admiration how children developed an almost instinctual understanding of food. What could be eaten raw, what needed boiling, what could be fermented, and what would make them ill. Alongside the struggle for physical survival, people also fought to maintain a semblance of emotional and social life. Secret gatherings, when they could be arranged safely, became lifelines. In basements and attics, neighbors shared news, sang old songs, and told stories that blended the fantastical with reality. One of the most enduring tales involved a group of musicians who performed a hidden concert on the edge of a forest. The story claimed that their music had the power to make soldiers stop in their tracks, if only for a moment, as if the melody itself imposed a fragile pause on the chaos outside. Whether true or exaggerated, the legend spread because it represented the belief that beauty could still exist even amid devastation. Legends of the supernatural continued to proliferate, often blending with the very real horrors of human cruelty. In several villages, people spoke of the Gray Train, which appeared silently on abandoned tracks during the dead of night. No one boarded it willingly, and those who were taken were rarely seen again. Some claimed it was a secret operation of the occupying forces, designed to transport prisoners silently, while others believed it carried the souls of the dead, moving between this world and another. Children were told to hide when the train was rumored to be near, and adults often avoided looking down tracks late at night. The mystery of the Gray Train became a shared experience, a way for people to confront their fear and give form to the unseen threats surrounding them. Despite the pervasive fear, moments of levity and defiance persisted. In occupied cities, people staged clandestine games, competitions, and performances. Children rolled makeshift balls in ruined streets. Adults told riddles to distract from hunger, and artists painted or carved in secret, leaving traces of creativity in spaces where it was least expected. These acts were small rebellions, affirmations of humanity, and they carried the weight of resistance even when nothing else could. Each story, each whispered legend, became part of a larger tapestry of survival, demonstrating that even in despair, people sought connection and meaning. One chilling legend that gained attention across multiple regions involved the Night Whisperer, an unseen presence said to move through occupied towns during curfew. Those who claimed to have encountered the Whisperer reported hearing their names called softly in the darkness, accompanied by the scent of smoke or damp earth. Some who followed the voice disappeared temporarily, only to return with cryptic messages or warnings of approaching danger. Others vanished permanently, leaving nothing behind. No one could explain whether the Night Whisperer was human, spectral, or a collective hallucination born of stress and fear. Yet the story spread widely, becoming a cautionary tale for both children and adults, a way to navigate the uncertainty of nightly survival. In addition to these supernatural figures, stories arose from the very real experience of forced labor, air raids, and military movements. People whispered about the Vanishing Convoy, a group of workers who left town at dawn and never returned. Others told of entire farms disappearing overnight under mysterious circumstances, with only footprints or a faint trail of smoke as evidence. These stories, terrifying as they were, helped people process events too sudden or horrific to understand. They transformed fear into narrative, creating patterns in chaos, and for many, that was a form of solace. Even in the smallest details of life, legend and reality intertwined. A cracked teacup might be said to ward off spirits, a well that never ran dry might be thought blessed, and a shadow moving differently from its owner could be interpreted as a sign. People became adept at reading these omens, whether out of superstition, imagination, or necessity. Each story was a layer of meaning imposed on a world that otherwise offered none, and collectively, they formed an intricate web of human experience, blending fear, hope, creativity, and memory. And so, as the war continued to stretch across years, the lives of those under occupation became an unbroken chain of survival, storytelling, and adaptation. From whispered legends of ghostly figures to practical innovations in food and clothing, people navigated a world where myth and reality overlapped, learning to endure, to hope, and to imagine even in the bleakest circumstances. In every story, in every legend, there was a glimpse of what it meant to remain human when humanity itself was under siege. As months turned into years, the rhythm of occupation shaped every aspect of life, both visible and hidden. Streets, once filled with laughter and commerce, became places of caution, where every glance could carry meaning and every knock at the door could bring terror. Yet within this oppressive framework, people adapted in ways both ingenious and quietly defiant. They created microcosms of normalcy where possible. Gardens in rubble-strewn courtyards, hidden stoves in basements, or secret gatherings where stories were exchanged, sometimes whispered, sometimes sung, always cautiously. And it was in these hidden moments that the most enduring legends flourished, as imagination and survival intertwined. One of the more persistent tales involved the Iron Soldier, a figure seen wandering in the outskirts of occupied cities. According to witnesses, he was clad entirely in dark metal, his helmet reflecting moonlight, but with eyes that seemed to glow through the visor. The Iron Soldier never spoke, never aimed his weapon, yet his presence alone could freeze a group of civilians in place. Some believed he was an experimental soldier created by the occupying forces, a machine designed for terror rather than combat. Others swore he was a ghost, a specter of the many men who had died in battle yet refused to leave the earth. Children were warned to avoid the outskirts at night. Adults whispered about him behind closed doors, and the story spread, becoming both fear and fascination, a symbol of the incomprehensible power that hovered over their lives. Food remained a central concern, and scarcity transformed daily habits into elaborate strategies for survival. Families rationed bread to the gram, collected rainwater for cooking, and used any scraps creatively. In some areas, people roasted acorns, crushed them into flour, and baked loaves that were hard and bitter, yet life-giving. Families would barter dried herbs or eggs for flour or potatoes, creating a delicate economy based on necessity and trust. Children learned the art of scavenging, finding edible roots in fields, foraging berries from hedgerows, even collecting discarded grains from mill floors. Every meal was a small victory, a reminder that life could persist despite deprivation. And every tale of a found or stolen ration became part of the growing network of legends that helped people navigate uncertainty. Legends were not limited to spectral figures. Some arose from real events exaggerated through fear and retelling. In several occupied towns, people spoke of the vanishing market, an entire collection of stalls and vendors that would appear in the morning only to vanish by afternoon, leaving nothing behind. Some claimed it was a trick of the occupying forces, a way to redistribute food secretly. Others insisted that it was supernatural, a place where the desperate could obtain sustenance if they dared risk the unknown. Children often dared one another to seek the vanishing market, and adults, more cautious, preferred to tell the story rather than investigate, knowing that legend itself had power. The war also created a fertile ground for stories about rescue and betrayal, often intertwined. In forests and mountains, partisans moved silently, leaving hidden caches of food and messages. Villagers who discovered these caches sometimes swore that mysterious figures appeared just long enough to guide them, then disappeared without a trace. In contrast, rumors of collaborators, people who betrayed neighbors for a loaf of bread or a few coins, spread rapidly, creating tension and mistrust even within families. Legends emerged, blending both heroism and fear, and in doing so, provided a framework to make sense of a reality where danger was constant and arbitrary. Amid these tales, daily life was punctuated by small, inventive acts of defiance. Children created toys from scraps of wood, metal, or fabric. Women mended clothes repeatedly, turning threadbare garments into patchwork coats. Men carved utensils from whatever materials were available, sometimes sharing them with neighbors to earn trust or gratitude. Even the simplest acts, lighting a candle in a window, leaving a note in a hidden corner, became symbolic gestures of humanity that persisted despite the constant threat of violence. In these gestures, ordinary people became heroes in their own right, and the stories they generated became the legends that would outlive the war. Some of the eeriest legends involved places rather than people. In a remote village, a well known as the Whispering Spring was said to echo the names of those who would not survive the week. Travelers who drew water were warned to remain silent, for speaking aloud might draw the attention of some unseen force. Whether the stories were born from superstition or the natural sounds of water and wind, the legend shaped behavior, ensuring caution in daily activities. Similarly, abandoned houses, burnt-out factories, and crumbling churches were described as having eyes, shadows that watched, or doors that moved slightly even when locked. Every object could become an omen, every movement a potential story. Even routine tasks, fetching firewood, gathering water, tending animals, became embedded in narrative. Children were told that forests contained watchers, that certain paths should be avoided, that stepping on a shadow might bring misfortune. Adults reinforced these tales, not always to frighten, but to instill caution, to protect the family in a world where threats were invisible, sudden, and deadly. In this way, legend and survival merged, each feeding the other in a continuous cycle. And so, as the war stretched on, life became a complex interplay of fear, ingenuity, storytelling, and endurance. From the Iron Soldier to the Vanishing Market, from whispered warnings to hidden celebrations, every legend, every small act, every survival strategy was part of a larger tapestry of existence under occupation. In the darkness and in the light, people learned to navigate both the tangible dangers and the shadows of the imagination, and through this navigation, they preserved not only their lives but also the memory of what it meant to endure, to hope, and to continue telling stories, even when the world itself seemed to have lost its shape. As the years of occupation deepened, the line between reality and legend grew increasingly blurred. Streets once familiar became alien, draped in shadows and punctuated by the abrupt crack of distant gunfire or the sudden glare of searchlights sweeping through narrow alleys. Even those who had endured years of hardship found themselves startled by sounds that had once been ordinary. A creaking door, the flutter of a curtain, the whistle of wind through broken roofs, because each could signal danger. Each could become the seed of a story that spread like wildfire. In these conditions, legends did more than entertain. They structured the perception of the world, offering explanations for the inexplicable, a framework to endure the relentless uncertainty. One of the most pervasive stories in occupied territories concerned the figure known as the Midnight Watcher. According to witnesses, he appeared only in the darkest hours, often near bridges or crossroads. He never spoke, yet those who saw him were left with an unshakable sense of being observed. Some claimed that looking directly at him would invite misfortune, while others insisted that he appeared to warn certain individuals of impending danger. Parents whispered warnings to their children, not out of fear alone, but as a means of teaching caution. Soldiers reportedly noticed him as well, pausing in patrols, sensing that something unseen measured their movements. The legend's persistence was tied to the universality of vigilance itself. In a world where danger lurked everywhere, the Midnight Watcher was an embodiment of the constant awareness required to survive. Meanwhile, food remained a source of both practical struggle and legendary narrative. Families devised ingenious methods to stretch rations. A single potato might be grated into thin slices, dried, and stored for weeks. Grains once meant for livestock were carefully processed for human consumption. Wild herbs and plants became crucial components of daily meals. Even bitter flavors were endured gratefully, because sustenance was precious. And in such scarcity, stories of miraculous finds, hidden caches of bread, unclaimed sacks of flour, or unexpected deliveries from sympathetic strangers spread rapidly, blending reality with hope and occasionally evolving into tales of supernatural intervention. A loaf of bread left on a windowsill might be whispered to possess protective qualities, or a basket of hidden vegetables might be said to have been placed there by a benevolent spirit, guiding the hand of the living. Daily routines became rituals partly for survival, partly as a way to impose order on chaos. Children learned to navigate ruins safely, identifying paths where debris could collapse or where soldiers might patrol. Adults devised schedules to maximize efficiency. Water collection at dawn, cooking and preservation in the mid-morning, quiet activities in the afternoon, and careful observation at night. Each ritual carried a layer of tension, a heightened awareness that was sometimes explained through legend. A particular patch of trees might be avoided not only because of patrols, but also because locals whispered that the shadow cat prowled there, an unseen feline spirit that watched trespassers, vanishing before any eye could confirm it. In occupied cities, secret acts of culture persisted despite danger. People staged clandestine performances in basements, attics, or abandoned buildings, where actors and musicians risked detection to maintain a sense of normalcy. One such legend described a hidden orchestra whose music, played at night, was said to make distant soldiers pause or listen in awe. While likely an exaggeration, the story captured the essence of human resilience. Art and imagination could flourish even amid destruction. Children who assisted in these performances, crafting puppets or instruments from scraps, became the unintentional carriers of these legends, spreading them in whispers through alleyways and courtyards. Supernatural stories often intertwined with the real dangers of occupation. The Silent Convoy was one such tale. Villagers spoke of long lines of trucks that appeared without warning, carrying neither soldiers nor cargo, yet marking the beginning of disappearances. Some insisted that the convoy transported prisoners to distant camps, while others believed it ferried souls into the unknown. The absence of concrete evidence only reinforced the legend, as the mind sought to impose order and explanation on inexplicable events. Children were warned to hide at night, adults speculated in hushed tones, and the story became embedded in the collective consciousness. Even ordinary objects took on significance. Lanterns were placed in windows not only for light but also as talismans against unseen threats. Small cracks in walls were interpreted as entry points for spirits or omens of misfortune. Clothing, patched repeatedly, carried stories of survival, with each repair representing both resourcefulness and an unspoken narrative of endurance. In some families, certain rooms or attics became repositories of memory and legend, where objects accumulated histories that blended the factual with the imagined. The war created a fertile environment for stories of rescue and betrayal. Partisans and local resistors operated in secrecy, leaving hidden messages, food caches, and warnings. Those who encountered these interventions often described mysterious figures who vanished immediately after helping, reinforcing the sense that the boundary between the human and the supernatural was thin. In contrast, tales of betrayal spread rapidly, often exaggerating the consequences of minor acts into warnings of lethal outcomes. Both types of stories served the same purpose: guiding behavior in an unpredictable and dangerous world. Even simple tasks, fetching water, gathering wood, or tending animals, became entwined with legend. People were taught to recognize shadows, listen for strange sounds, and avoid paths where misfortune was rumored to dwell. Over time, these warnings became so embedded that distinguishing between pragmatic caution and superstition was nearly impossible. Each story, each whispered warning, became a thread in a vast web of survival, imagination, and memory, illustrating the human need to navigate a world where every choice could be critical. And so, as the years continued to weigh on the people of occupied territories, life was not only a struggle to survive, but also a tapestry of stories, legends, and rituals. From the Midnight Watcher to the Shadow Cat, from hidden bread caches to miraculous rescues, every tale provided a lens through which to interpret the incomprehensible, a means to endure fear, and a way to preserve a sense of identity and humanity amidst relentless oppression. In this interweaving of reality and myth, people found the strength to continue, knowing that stories, terrifying, wondrous, and improbable, were themselves a form of resistance. By this point, the lines between history, rumor, and legend had blurred so completely that people sometimes could not distinguish one from the other, and perhaps it no longer mattered. Life under occupation was a delicate dance between survival and imagination. Each step measured, each decision weighted by the knowledge that a single miscalculation could mean death or disappearance. In the evenings, when curfew settled over streets like a heavy blanket, people huddled in attics, basements, and hidden corners, exchanging tales that gave shape to a world otherwise dominated by chaos. These stories were more than entertainment. They were a lifeline, a guide, and sometimes a warning, passed from one person to the next like carefully coded messages. One of the most persistent and chilling stories told in several regions involved the Lantern Children, spectral figures said to drift silently along deserted streets. These children, always pale and unnaturally still, carried small lanterns that glowed with a faint, almost green light. They were never heard speaking, yet those who saw them reported a sense of inevitable doom, as though the lanterns marked a destiny that could not be avoided. Some families swore that giving a piece of bread to the Lantern Children would grant protection, while others believed that any interaction at all could summon misfortune. Adults whispered the legend to their children not to frighten them for no reason, but to instill caution, a way of surviving in a world where ordinary rules no longer applied. Despite the fear, pockets of ingenuity and creativity persisted. In occupied villages, people staged secret gatherings to maintain cultural traditions, songs, dances, and storytelling sessions hidden behind locked doors. In some towns, musicians fashioned instruments from broken furniture and scraps of metal, creating orchestras that performed for small, hidden audiences. Children assisted by crafting tiny puppets or masks, while elders narrated tales of the past, blending history with legend. Each gathering became a fragile act of defiance, a reminder that humanity could persist even in the harshest of conditions. In these moments, stories about the supernatural often intertwined seamlessly with real events, creating legends that were impossible to separate from reality. Food, as ever, remained a critical concern. People devised ever more ingenious ways to stretch limited resources. Grain intended for animals was processed into flour for bread. Roots and wild herbs were boiled to make soups that, though thin and bitter, could sustain life. Families rationed meticulously, saving small portions for emergencies, trading scraps with neighbors, and creating hidden caches. Every meal, no matter how meager, became a symbol of resilience. And as often happened in times of scarcity, the act of finding or preparing food became legendary itself. A story of survival passed down from one neighbor to another, enhanced with each retelling to emphasize cleverness, bravery, or miraculous luck. Legends also evolved to incorporate both danger and hope simultaneously. The Whistling Soldier was a tale spread across several towns. A lone figure, always seen on the edge of battlefields or deserted streets, who would whistle a single, haunting tune. Witnesses claimed that anyone who heard it and heeded the warning could avoid a sudden raid or bombing, while those who ignored it would soon face misfortune. No one knew who or what he was, yet the story spread quickly, shaping behavior and providing a narrative framework for interpreting sudden events. Parents told the story to children, resistance members whispered it to recruits, and even adults found themselves pausing when a distant whistle carried on the wind, unsure whether it was real or imagined. Daily survival demanded extraordinary ingenuity. Clothing was patched repeatedly, often becoming a quilt of different materials stitched together, and shoes were fashioned from scraps of leather, wood, or tire. In some villages, people created hidden compartments in homes to store food or documents, crafting spaces that were invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the layout. Children played games that mimicked real survival skills, learning through play how to navigate dangerous terrain, recognize signs of soldiers, and scavenge for resources. Even play became a form of preparation, and each skill learned in secret became part of a broader legend of endurance. In addition to human ingenuity, the environment itself became a source of legend. Forests, once neutral, were now imbued with power and threat. Some were said to be haunted by spirits of the dead, while others were believed to protect partisans, guiding them along hidden paths invisible to the occupiers. Snow and fog could transform ordinary landscapes into eerie domains where every sound seemed amplified, and every shadow became a figure to be watched. In this way, the natural world became a participant in the stories, a co-author of legends that blended reality with imagination, making the act of moving through it both a necessity and a trial. Even the most mundane objects took on symbolic weight. A cracked mirror might be said to reveal hidden truths. A lantern placed in a window could ward off spirits or signal safety. A door left ajar might invite fortune or danger. Families developed rituals around these objects, blending superstition with practicality, and each object accumulated a history, a legend, a story intertwined with the experiences of those who interacted with it. The boundary between ordinary life and legend grew so thin that sometimes even the simplest actions, lighting a fire, drawing water, feeding an animal, were performed with awareness of the potential consequences described in stories. And so, as darkness fell over occupied towns, life continued in its precarious rhythm, a combination of survival, ritual, and storytelling. The lantern children, the whistling soldier, secret orchestras, hidden caches, and countless other figures and events formed a continuous tapestry, interweaving legend with the stark reality of war. Each tale provided guidance, warning, and hope, shaping behavior and perception, and allowing people to endure. In this way, stories became a lifeline, a shared consciousness that preserved memory, identity, and humanity in a world defined by fear, scarcity, and uncertainty. As the war stretched on, the ordinary and the extraordinary began to fuse into a seamless, almost dreamlike existence, where each day was defined by both survival and story. Villages and towns, battered by conflict, transformed into landscapes filled with echoes of artillery, of distant shouting, of whispered warnings that traveled along cobblestones and across rooftops. The people learned to listen carefully, not only for sound, but for meaning, and it was in these attentivenesses that legends flourished. Tales spread from ear to ear, often blending truth and imagination so completely that it became impossible to tell one from the other, and perhaps that ambiguity was part of what allowed them to endure. Among the most widely recounted stories was that of the Glass Watcher. This figure was said to appear in shattered windows or the reflection of broken mirrors, always just at the edge of vision. Those who glimpsed him claimed he never moved in a conventional sense. He seemed to shift subtly, a shadow within the glass that observed silently, following people through streets and alleys without leaving footprints. Some said the Glass Watcher marked individuals who would face danger or who had already crossed paths with fate in ways unseen. Children were warned never to stare too long into mirrors, while adults joked nervously that he was more reliable than any soldier or informer. The story spread quickly, feeding on itself, because the imagination needed structure, and the unseen required explanation. Despite the ever-present fear, life adapted. Food continued to be scarce, yet innovation thrived in response to necessity. Families roasted dandelion roots to make coffee substitutes, boiled tree bark to add bulk to soups, and used every scrap of vegetable matter to avoid waste. Each meager meal became a story of resourcefulness, a triumph of human ingenuity in the face of deprivation. Sometimes, These acts of improvisation gave rise to legends of miraculous provision. A single potato that seemed to replenish itself, a cache of grain appearing where none had been hidden. These tales, whispered from neighbor to neighbor, were not only a means of entertaining children, but also a subtle reinforcement of hope, a narrative antidote to despair. Stories of both heroism and horror persisted in parallel. The Silver Fox was one such legend, a mysterious figure who was said to sabotage supply lines, steal from occupying forces, and vanish without a trace. Witnesses described fleeting glimpses, a flash of movement across rooftops, a fox-like figure slipping through alleyways, or a glint of silver under moonlight. Some claimed the Silver Fox was human, others swore it was something more. The legend gave ordinary people courage, a reminder that even when powerless, cunning and courage could influence events. It also served as a warning, a way to teach young people the necessity of vigilance, patience, and cleverness in a dangerous world. Daily life, even in the midst of legend and fear, demanded adaptation. Clothing was patched and repatched, often becoming almost unrecognizable as garments took on new shapes, textures, and patterns with each repair. Shoes were carefully maintained or improvised from scraps, and even minor tools were repurposed repeatedly to serve multiple functions. Children learned to navigate streets, rubble, and forests safely, while adults devised hidden compartments and secret routes to store food, weapons, and information. Every small act of preparation became embedded with stories and warnings, forming a complex network of guidance that blended survival, superstition, and imagination. One of the eeriest tales involved the Fog Walkers, figures said to emerge from morning mist or evening haze. Travelers reported feeling an unseen presence beside them, hearing the faintest shuffle of movement, yet seeing nothing clearly. Some claimed the Fog Walkers guided lost individuals to safety. Others said they led the unwary to danger. The duality of their role, protective and threatening, made them particularly compelling as stories, because they reflected the uncertainty of life itself under occupation. People began to incorporate their presence into daily routines, avoiding paths when the fog rolled in or interpreting subtle changes in weather as omens. In doing so, legend became practical guidance, a tool to navigate a world where the ordinary could kill as easily as the extraordinary. Even mundane objects and routines acquired symbolic significance. Lanterns were placed in windows not only for light, but to signify safe houses or alert neighbors of danger. Water sources, particularly wells and springs, became sites of legend. Some whispered that certain wells never ran dry, while others said that approaching the wrong spring could invite misfortune. Objects in homes, a cracked mirror, a tilted chair, a loose floorboard, acquired meaning beyond their physical presence. Families developed rituals around them, not only for superstition but as a way of asserting control in a world that had been stripped of predictability. In addition to supernatural figures, tales of human ingenuity and courage continued to flourish. Resistance members became characters in a growing oral history of survival, with their acts amplified and stylized in retelling. Messages left in hidden compartments, food caches created in forests, and daring escapes from patrols all became stories in which danger and triumph were inseparable. These narratives were both practical and psychological, offering instruction and reassurance, a map of survival drawn from the collective experience of ordinary people living extraordinary lives. And so, as nights grew longer and the shadow of war stretched over cities and countryside alike, people relied on both tangible skills and intangible stories to navigate life. The Glass Watcher, the Silver Fox, the Fog Walkers, hidden caches, improvised meals, secret performances, all formed a complex, interwoven tapestry of legend and reality. Each story provided a lens through which to interpret events, a buffer against fear, and a thread connecting one generation to the next. In these stories, fear became narrative, scarcity became ingenuity, and survival became an act of imagination as much as endurance, ensuring that humanity persisted even under the most relentless oppression. By this stage of the war, the fabric of daily existence had become an intricate dance of observation, improvisation, and caution, intertwined with stories that were as much a survival mechanism as any rationed meal or hidden cache. People moved through their environments with a heightened awareness, learning to read shadows, interpret sounds, and detect the smallest shifts in the landscape that might indicate danger. Yet even amid this vigilance, life demanded moments of adaptation, creativity, and human connection. And it was in these moments that legends continued to flourish, growing richer, darker, and sometimes inexplicably miraculous. One story that gained traction involved the Rust Man, a figure said to appear near abandoned vehicles, machinery, or industrial ruins, covered head to toe in corroded metal, with joints that seemed to creak with every movement. He was reportedly silent yet unmistakably present. People claimed that encountering him at night meant an impending challenge or a test of courage. Some described him bending the rules of reality, doors opening where they should not, walls stretching subtly, or shadows twisting unnaturally. While adults often tried to rationalize these accounts, children embraced them, weaving the Rust Man into games and tales, imagining him as both threat and guardian. The legend spread because it embodied the uncertainty of life under occupation, a figure who might punish or protect depending entirely on circumstance. Scarcity of food continued to shape behavior in extraordinary ways. Families scavenged for every possible resource, from wild plants to leftover grains, often creating elaborate systems for preservation. Smoked herbs, dried mushrooms, and boiled roots became staples. In some regions, people concocted experimental dishes, mixing ingredients that would otherwise never meet in peacetime kitchens, and these meals themselves became stories, sometimes humorous, sometimes tragic, passed on as examples of human ingenuity. Children learned to forage, distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones, and participate in food preparation, turning survival into a shared narrative of adaptation. Even simple acts, such as baking a loaf of bread or saving a few potatoes, became heroic in the context of scarcity. Legends of both horror and hope proliferated simultaneously. One such tale told of the crying bell, an old church bell that, according to witnesses, emitted a sorrowful wail at night. Some claimed it was a warning, foretelling raids or disappearances, while others believed it was mourning the countless lives lost in silence. Families living nearby claimed to hear the bell only on nights when danger was imminent, though the sound seemed impossible to locate or verify. The legend persisted because it offered both explanation and ritual. People developed superstitions around it, leaving candles or small offerings in the churchyard, or choosing paths to avoid hearing the sound. And in doing so, the story became part of daily survival. Even in mundane routines, stories provided structure and guidance. Children were taught to recognize subtle patterns. A flickering light in a distant window might indicate a hidden ally. The placement of stones along a path might mark a safe route, and a particular knock on a door could signal danger. These small cues became embedded in local legend, forming a complex web of communication, instruction, and cautionary tale. Adults reinforced these lessons with stories of previous encounters, where ignoring subtle signs had led to misfortune. Over time, these narratives became inseparable from lived experience, blurring the lines between practical knowledge and folklore. Human ingenuity remained a constant, often giving rise to stories of near-miraculous escapes or clever solutions. People devised hidden compartments, secret tunnels, and clever disguises to protect families, resources, and information. Music, art, and theater continued in clandestine forms, offering both distraction and hope. A performance in a cellar might be remembered not just for its content, but for the risks taken to present it, transforming a simple play into a legend of courage. Children who participated became carriers of these tales, ensuring that each story of bravery, ingenuity, or narrow escape was passed along, growing more intricate with each retelling. supernatural legends continued to overlap with real-world events. The Pale Rider was one figure whose story was whispered across towns and villages. Seen only at twilight, riding a horse that seemed to be made of mist, he appeared near sites of imminent danger. Some claimed he guided civilians away from bombs or patrols. Others insisted he collected the souls of those doomed to vanish. The ambiguity of his nature, protector or harbinger, made him a compelling presence in local lore, a manifestation of the unpredictable forces at play in everyday survival. Families cautioned children to heed his appearance but not to approach too closely, embedding both fear and respect into the legend. Even in the natural world, humans found stories and patterns. Forests, rivers, and hills were filled with signs interpreted as messages. A broken branch might signal a hidden observer. A disturbed flock of birds could indicate approaching danger, and shadows cast by moonlight were read as omens. In these readings, the landscape became a participant in the legend, shaping both physical movement and imagination. Every journey, whether to fetch water, gather firewood, or visit neighbors, carried layers of practical caution, symbolic meaning, and narrative tension. And so, as darkness stretched across occupied lands, life continued in a fragile balance of vigilance, imagination, and resourcefulness. The Rust Man, the Crying Bell, the Pale Rider, hidden caches, improvised meals, and clandestine performances formed an intertwined tapestry of legend and lived experience. Each story provided context, guidance, and comfort, helping people navigate fear, scarcity, and uncertainty. Through these stories, people maintained a sense of identity, humanity, and continuity, proving that even in the most oppressive circumstances, imagination, resilience, and narrative could coexist with survival, creating a world where legend and reality flowed together like an unbroken stream. By now, the passage of time under occupation had transformed ordinary life into a complex interplay of survival, observation, and legend, where every gesture, sound, or shadow could carry meaning far beyond its appearance. Streets, once bustling with routine activity, had become theaters for both caution and narrative, where people moved with acute awareness, noting subtle changes and patterns that might signify danger. And it was in this heightened attentiveness that the most persistent and haunting stories took root, growing in detail, richness, and complexity, blending fact with imagination in a way that helped people endure the relentless pressures of daily life. One story that persisted in multiple towns involved the Shadow Weaver, a figure said to appear only at the edges of light, where darkness met illumination. Witnesses described a presence that seemed fluid, shifting like smoke, capable of weaving between objects or slipping through walls without making a sound. Some claimed the Shadow Weaver observed without intent to harm, acting as a sentinel of the unseen, while others insisted it was a harbinger, appearing before sudden misfortune struck. The legend spread rapidly because it resonated with lived experience. In a world where danger could strike without warning, a figure who embodied vigilance, mystery, and unpredictability captured the imagination of both children and adults. Families warned young ones to notice shadows carefully, while elders recounted encounters in hushed tones, reinforcing both caution and fascination. Food remained an ongoing struggle, and human ingenuity gave rise to stories that were practical, moral, and often miraculous. Families developed creative methods for preserving meager supplies, drying vegetables over improvised racks, fermenting roots to make edible pastes, and boiling herbs to create flavorful, but scarce, broths. In some regions, particularly inventive children discovered hidden edibles in forests or fields, turning scavenging into a game and their discoveries into local legend. Meals became symbols of perseverance, and the act of preparing food took on narrative significance. Even a simple loaf of bread could be celebrated as a triumph over scarcity, inspiring stories that emphasized cleverness, luck, and endurance, sometimes growing fantastical in retelling to underscore human resilience. Parallel to practical survival, legends of courage and heroism continued to emerge. The Iron Crow was one such figure, a lone operative moving silently through occupied territories, sabotaging enemy equipment and disappearing before anyone could identify them. Descriptions varied. Some claimed to see glints of metal feathers in moonlight. Others insisted the Iron Crow could pass through locked doors unseen. But all agreed that the figure represented cleverness and bravery beyond ordinary human capacity. Adults used the story to teach young people the importance of vigilance and ingenuity, while children transformed the figure into a hero of imagination, blending reality with legend in ways that reinforced both caution and hope. Daily life, even amid fear and scarcity, demanded structure and ritual. Clothing, repeatedly patched and repatched, became a patchwork of survival, with each repair telling a story of ingenuity or necessity. Shoes, often improvised from scraps, were maintained meticulously. Hidden compartments, secret routes, and carefully observed pathways became integral to movement, forming an intricate web of precaution that blended legend with strategy. Every gesture, fetching water, carrying firewood, tending animals, carried narrative weight, and children learned to read signs, interpret omens, and participate in acts of both survival and storytelling. Supernatural legends intertwined with tangible danger in ways that shaped behavior. The Glass Phantom was a figure reported to appear in reflections of broken glass or puddles, always at moments of choice. Which path to take, which window to enter, which alley to cross. Witnesses claimed that he could signal safety or misfortune, guiding some and confusing others. The dual nature of these tales reinforced lessons of attentiveness and caution, providing a framework for navigating a world in which unpredictability was constant. Families incorporated these stories into daily routines, ensuring that even the most fantastical elements served practical purposes, helping people remain alert while preserving a sense of wonder. Even objects themselves became participants in legend. Lanterns signaled safety or danger depending on placement and timing. Cracks in walls, loose floorboards, and bent nails carried symbolic meaning. Even the way smoke drifted from a chimney could be interpreted as a sign. These observations were not only superstition, they were practical lessons encoded in narrative form, teaching vigilance, resourcefulness, and subtlety. Each object, gesture, or sound became layered with history and meaning, creating an intricate, living tapestry of survival and legend. Acts of creativity persisted despite risk, further fueling the tapestry of stories. Secret gatherings, musical performances, and clandestine plays continued in hidden spaces. Instruments fashioned from scraps, songs adapted to reflect local events, and stories told in whispers contributed to a cultural continuity that was otherwise under threat. Each performance, every act of shared creativity, became legendary in itself, remembered and retold as a story of courage and ingenuity, blending practical action with imagination in a way that sustained both morale and memory. And so, as the nights stretched long and the shadow of occupation deepened, people navigated life through a mixture of caution, creativity, and legend. The Shadow Weaver, the Iron Crow, the Glass Phantom, hidden caches, improvised meals, and clandestine performances all wove together into a continuous narrative that both reflected and shaped reality. Through these stories, people maintained vigilance, preserved hope, and asserted their humanity, proving that even in the harshest conditions, imagination, resilience, and narrative were as vital as food, shelter, or protection. In this interweaving of fact and legend, life continued, fragile yet enduring, a testament to the capacity of humans to survive and to tell their stories, even when the world itself seemed to be unraveling. As the war pressed on, the sense of time itself became fluid, measured less by calendars and clocks than by the rhythms of survival, the recurring presence of patrols, and the whispers of legend that threaded through everyday life. Each day was a careful negotiation between routine and danger, between reality and imagination. And it was in this constant interplay that stories thrived, growing more vivid and complex with every telling. The ordinary, gathering water, mending clothes, preparing meager meals, was suffused with the extraordinary, the hints of the unseen, and the shadows of legends that hovered just beyond perception. One of the most enduring tales involved the Twilight Messenger, a spectral figure said to carry messages between hidden resistance groups, appearing only as dusk settled over rooftops or forests. Witnesses described a presence so fleeting it could barely be captured in memory. A shadow gliding silently along walls, a faint glimmer of movement between trees, a rustle that suggested more than the wind could explain. Some claimed that the messenger brought instructions, warnings, or news of supplies. Others insisted that it appeared to test the courage of those who encountered it. Children were cautioned never to follow its light or shadow, while adults interpreted sightings as either encouragement or forewarning. The story's persistence lay in its ambiguity. No one could confirm the messenger's existence, yet its legend informed behavior and decision-making across towns and villages. Food continued to define the daily experience, both as a challenge and as a source of narrative richness. Families employed ingenious methods to maximize nutrition from meager resources. Acorns and dandelion roots were roasted and ground into flour. Leaves and bark were boiled to add bulk to soups. Every scrap of vegetable or grain was conserved and stored. Occasionally, miraculous events occurred. A hidden sack of potatoes discovered under floorboards, a container of grain left unclaimed in a cellar, and these became stories retold with a mix of awe and practical instruction. Children were often involved in these discoveries, learning survival skills while also becoming the narrators of legend, blending the factual with the fantastical in ways that reinforced both vigilance and hope. Legends of courage, cunning, and defiance continued to grow. The Night Falcon was one such figure, said to operate during the blackest hours, slipping past guards, sabotaging enemy equipment, and leaving behind no trace of presence. Accounts varied widely. Some claimed to see the glint of feathers under moonlight. Others insisted the falcon could vanish entirely, reappearing only when necessary, but all agreed that it represented a combination of human ingenuity and daring. The legend inspired ordinary people to take small, brave actions, whether hiding food, conveying messages, or assisting strangers, reinforcing a sense that resistance was possible even in an environment of constant oppression. Daily life remained an intricate weave of caution, creativity, and survival strategies. Clothing was patched repeatedly, often resulting in garments that were unique composites of multiple fabrics. Shoes were repaired obsessively, sometimes with materials scavenged from tires, leather scraps, or wood. Hidden compartments, tunnels, and secret routes were used not only to store supplies but also to communicate messages, creating a network of practical knowledge intertwined with legend. Children were taught to interpret subtle signs in the environment: broken twigs, displaced stones, the behavior of animals, as potential indicators of danger. And these lessons became stories in themselves, passed along orally and augmented with imagination. Supernatural and eerie tales continued to shape perception. The Wandering Lantern was one such story, a small, glowing orb that appeared at night, drifting along streets or across fields. Those who followed it were said to find either danger or unexpected assistance, while those who ignored it might avoid misfortune entirely. Families incorporated these stories into routines, emphasizing caution while also creating a sense of wonder and possibility. Similarly, natural phenomena: fog rolling in from rivers, shadows stretching unnaturally, the sudden flight of birds, were interpreted as signs, legends that guided behavior while reinforcing the sense that the world itself was alive, aware, and unpredictable. Even the smallest objects acquired layers of meaning. Cracked mirrors, lanterns, loose floorboards, and tilted chairs could all become omens, reminders, or tools for storytelling. These objects were not merely physical. They carried histories, lessons, and cautionary tales. Families developed rituals around their use, blending superstition and practicality, ensuring that each gesture reinforced awareness and resilience. The ordinary became extraordinary, and survival itself was encoded in narrative, passed from one generation to the next in whispers, stories, and subtle cues. Cultural and creative acts persisted despite risk, becoming part of the evolving tapestry of legend. Secret performances, music, storytelling sessions, and clandestine art projects continued in hidden spaces. Instruments fashioned from scraps, improvised scripts, and songs adapted to reflect local events were celebrated for both artistry and bravery. Children participated, helping to create masks, puppets, or miniature props, and through their involvement became carriers of stories, ensuring that tales of courage, ingenuity, and survival were preserved and amplified. These activities were as much about maintaining identity and morale as they were about entertainment, embedding legends into the rhythm of everyday life. And so, as darkness fell over occupied towns and forests, life was guided simultaneously by vigilance, imagination, and narrative. The Twilight Messenger, the Night Falcon, hidden food caches, improvised meals, and clandestine performances all formed a complex, interwoven tapestry of legend and lived experience. Each story provided instruction, reassurance, and a framework for navigating fear, scarcity, and uncertainty. Through these tales, people preserved their humanity, strengthened community bonds, and maintained hope, demonstrating that even under the relentless weight of occupation, imagination, courage, and narrative could coexist with the struggle to survive. As the seasons changed, the rhythm of life under occupation remained relentless. Yet within the monotony of survival, stories and legends flourished, carrying both caution and inspiration. Each day was measured not by ordinary events but by small victories and near misses, by whispers of shadowed figures, and by the careful observation of details that might seem insignificant to outsiders. People learned to read the language of the environment. The creak of a floorboard signaling a visitor, the flutter of a curtain hinting at a patrol, the behavior of animals indicating unseen danger. It was through this hyper-attentiveness that new legends emerged, blending the real and imagined into a continuous narrative that guided behavior, taught lessons, and preserved hope. One particularly pervasive tale involved the Whispering Bridge, a seemingly ordinary crossing over a river that carried a reputation far beyond its physical form. According to witnesses, voices could be heard emanating from beneath its arches at night, soft murmurs that seemed to speak warnings, secrets, or guidance. Some said the voices belonged to the spirits of those who had perished nearby, while others insisted they were messages from hidden partisans. Travelers were advised to move quickly and silently across the bridge, heedful of both the sound and the shadows, and children were warned never to linger, lest they attract unseen attention. The legend persisted because it offered both an explanation for the inexplicable and a tool for teaching caution, embedding survival strategies within narrative form. Food remained a central concern, and human ingenuity continued to evolve under pressure. Families developed increasingly sophisticated methods of rationing and preservation. Roots, bark, and wild herbs were combined to make soups. Grains were milled into flour and mixed with substitutes to extend quantity. Leaves and grasses sometimes added bulk when nothing else was available. These practices gave rise to stories, often fantastical, about miraculous survival. Hidden stashes appearing just in time, a loaf of bread that fed more mouths than it should have, or a handful of herbs that provided unexpected strength. Children were involved in the search for sustenance, turning the act of foraging into a game that reinforced practical knowledge while inspiring legend. These tales of provision, survival, and ingenuity were retold across households, enhancing both morale and communal memory. Alongside practical stories, legends of courage and cunning thrived. The Silver Hawk was a figure whose presence was recounted across multiple villages. Said to operate in the dead of night, the Hawk reportedly sabotaged enemy equipment, rescued captives, and left cryptic messages for civilians. Witnesses described a silhouette gliding silently across rooftops or disappearing into shadowy alleys, a figure both feared and revered. The legend of the Silver Hawk offered more than inspiration. It provided a model for behavior, encouraging ingenuity, caution, and moral courage. Children imagine the hawk in their games, while adults interpreted sightings or coincidences as guidance, illustrating the seamless blending of legend with lived experience. Daily routines were imbued with legend, as ordinary tasks required extraordinary awareness. Clothing, repeatedly patched, became a symbolic record of resourcefulness. Shoes were maintained meticulously or improvised entirely. Hidden compartments, tunnels, and secret routes were integrated into movement through both homes and landscapes, forming networks that combined practical survival with storytelling. Children learned to recognize subtle signs of danger, displaced stones, broken branches, or animal movements. Each lesson, each observation, was incorporated into the tapestry of narrative, teaching vigilance and reinforcing the importance of attentiveness. Eerie and supernatural stories continued to shape perception. The Moonlight Walker was said to appear only under a pale moon, gliding along deserted streets or through forests. Some claimed the walker guided those in danger, while others insisted it was a harbinger of misfortune. Families adapted routines based on sightings, teaching children to read signs and act accordingly. Natural phenomena, shifts in wind, sudden changes in temperature, distant animal calls, were interpreted as messages, blending the physical world with legend. These interpretations reinforced attentiveness, ensuring that both imagination and practical survival strategies were intertwined. Even objects became carriers of story and meaning. Lanterns indicated safety or danger. Cracked mirrors suggested warnings. Loose floorboards concealed messages or supplies. Families developed rituals around these objects, blending superstition with practicality. Each action, lighting a fire, placing a lantern, moving quietly, was informed by both legend and lived experience, creating a sense of order in an otherwise chaotic world. The boundary between ordinary and extraordinary had disappeared, leaving life as a continuous narrative of vigilance, improvisation, and story. Cultural persistence remained crucial. Secret performances, storytelling sessions, and improvised music continued in hidden spaces, sustaining morale and community identity. Instruments fashioned from scraps, songs adapted to current events, and children participating in performances ensured that legends were perpetuated and amplified. These acts of creativity were simultaneously practical and symbolic, preserving culture, teaching lessons, and embedding narrative into everyday survival. And so, as darkness fell across towns and forests under occupation, life unfolded through a delicate balance of vigilance, imagination, and narrative. The Whispering Bridge, the Silver Hawk, the Moonlight Walker, hidden food caches, improvised meals, and secret performances formed an intertwined tapestry of legend and lived experience. Each story guided behavior, reinforced hope, and preserved identity. Through these tales, humanity endured, demonstrating that even under the relentless pressure of war, imagination, courage, and narrative could sustain life, offering structure, comfort, and the possibility of survival when the world seemed most uncertain. As the months dragged on, the ordinary rhythms of life under occupation began to fold into the extraordinary, and the boundary between legend and reality became nearly imperceptible. Every corner of streets, forests, and villages seemed to whisper of unseen presences, subtle dangers, and improbable rescues. People learned to read signs in everything: the behavior of animals, the movement of shadows, even the seemingly random placement of objects. And in doing so, they shaped narratives that became essential guides for survival. Stories were no longer mere entertainment. They were instructions, warnings, and maps of a hidden world layered atop the visible one. Among the most chilling and persistent legends was that of the Iron Lantern, a figure said to patrol empty streets at night, carrying a lantern that glowed with an unnatural red light. Witnesses described its movements as both deliberate and impossible, gliding over cobblestones without leaving a trace, appearing suddenly at intersections and vanishing when approached. Some claimed the Iron Lantern signaled imminent danger, whether patrols, raids, or sudden airstrikes, while others insisted that it rewarded those who had acted bravely or cleverly during the day. Children were warned to avoid it, while adults observed it cautiously, sometimes taking indirect cues from its appearance to plan movement or timing. The legend persisted not only because it captivated the imagination, but also because it provided a framework for interpreting the unpredictable, teaching caution and attentiveness through narrative. Food scarcity continued to dominate daily life, yet human ingenuity and storytelling intertwined to turn survival into legend. Families developed increasingly complex ways to ration and preserve supplies, creating meals that combined necessity with invention. Roots, bark, and weeds were transformed into soups. Acorns and grains were ground into flour substitutes. Leaves and wild herbs added nutrition and texture. Every successful meal, every unexpected discovery of hidden stores, became a story retold with embellishment. A loaf of bread that fed an entire family, a handful of roots that provided energy for days, or a single egg miraculously saved. Children participated actively, learning the skills needed for survival while contributing to the ongoing narrative, which in turn reinforced communal resilience and resourcefulness. Courageous acts and human ingenuity were constantly celebrated through legend. The Silver Lynx became a figure of both awe and instruction, a clandestine operative who moved with near invisibility through forests and towns, sabotaging enemy operations, delivering messages, and rescuing captives. Witnesses described fleeting glimpses, a shadow slipping across a roof, a metallic glint in moonlight, a sudden disappearance into foliage. The Silver Lynx inspired both admiration and emulation, serving as a symbolic guide for ordinary people navigating extraordinary dangers. Children imagined themselves as part of the legend, while adults used the stories to encourage prudence, cleverness, and bravery, illustrating how myth and reality could coexist as a tool for survival. The ordinary routines of daily life were similarly intertwined with legend. Clothing was repeatedly patched, creating garments that told stories through the textures, patterns, and materials sewn together over time. Shoes were meticulously repaired or improvised, becoming symbols of endurance. Hidden compartments, tunnels, and routes were integrated into homes and streets, forming a network that combined practical survival with narrative memory. Children were taught to notice subtle indicators: disturbed soil, displaced stones, sudden animal movement, and each observation was reinforced with a story, ensuring that knowledge and caution were transmitted organically through generations. Supernatural tales remained potent and influential. The Fog Rider was a figure said to appear only in dense fog or mist, moving along roads, rivers, and forests. Some claimed it guided travelers to safety. Others insisted it led the unwary to danger. Families and communities incorporated these sightings into routines, teaching children to interpret environmental cues, avoid unnecessary risks, and act cautiously. Weather patterns, animal behavior, and environmental anomalies became part of the legend, creating a living map of survival where imagination and practicality intertwined seamlessly. Even mundane objects gained narrative weight. Cracked mirrors, tilted chairs, lanterns, and floorboards became symbols, warnings, or tools for storytelling. Families developed rituals around their use, blending superstition with pragmatic necessity, ensuring that attention to detail was reinforced through story. The ordinary became extraordinary, and each act of survival, from lighting a fire to moving quietly through streets, was layered with narrative significance, creating a continuous stream of vigilance, imagination, and strategy. Cultural resilience persisted through clandestine performances, music, storytelling, and art, often carried out in secret spaces. Instruments were crafted from scraps, songs adapted to reflect current events, and children participated by creating props, masks, or small visual elements. These performances were not merely entertainment. They were acts of defiance, memory preservation, and community building. Each event became a legend, retold in whispers and stories, reinforcing social bonds and ensuring that the cultural narrative endured alongside the practical acts of survival. Thus, as darkness fell and the landscape of occupied towns and forests stretched into shadow, life became a continuous interplay of vigilance, imagination, and narrative. The Iron Lantern, the Silver Lynx, the Fog Rider, hidden food caches, improvised meals, and secret performances all intertwined into a living tapestry of legend and experience. Each story offered guidance, reassurance, and instruction, helping people navigate fear, scarcity, and uncertainty. Through these narratives, humanity endured, demonstrating that even under relentless oppression, imagination, courage, and storytelling could coexist with the struggle to survive, preserving both identity and hope in a world where the line between reality and legend had long since dissolved.